A little boy disappeared from his bed in the middle of the night, and for 10 years, not a single clue was found. But then, one ordinary evening, his mother pressed play on an old recording toy, and what came out left investigators speechless. Imagine tucking your 7-year-old son into bed, kissing his forehead goodnight, and waking up the next morning to find his room empty. The window open. No signs of struggle. No footprints in the garden below. Just nothing. What would you do if your child's voice came back to you 10 years after they vanished? Not in a dream, not in your imagination, but recorded on a small plastic toy, capturing sounds that should never have been there. Sounds that would make seasoned detectives question everything they thought they knew about that night in 1991. This is the story of Tommy Martinez, a bright-eyed 7-year-old who loved dinosaurs, collected baseball cards, and had a habit of talking to his toys. It's the story of a family torn apart by an impossible mystery. And it's the story of how a child's innocent recording device became the key to unlocking one of the most haunting cold cases in small-town America. But before we get to that moment when Janet Martinez pressed play on that old toy, we need to go back to the night it all began. The night when everything changed forever. March 15, 1991. Millbrook was the kind of town where neighbors knew each other's names and children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. The Martinez family lived on Maple Street in a modest 2-story house with blue shutters and a tire swing in the backyard. It was the American dream wrapped in suburban simplicity. Tommy Martinez was 7 years old, with sandy brown hair that never stayed combed and eyes that sparkled with curiosity about everything around him. He was the kind of child who asked why about everything. Why do birds fly south? Why is the sky blue? Why do grown-ups drink coffee if it tastes so bad? His parents, Janet and Miguel, cherished these moments of wonder, even when Tommy's endless questions delayed bedtime by 30 minutes every night. That Tuesday evening started like any other. Miguel had returned from his job at the hardware store around 6 p.m., tired but happy to see his family. Janet had prepared Tommy's favorite dinner, spaghetti and meatballs, and they ate together at the kitchen table while Tommy recounted his day at Lincoln Elementary. He'd learned about dinosaurs in science class and was particularly excited about the Tyrannosaurus rex. "Dad, did you know a T-Rex's teeth were as big as bananas?" Tommy had said, his mouth full of spaghetti. "That's pretty big, buddy," Miguel had replied, ruffling his son's hair. After dinner, the family settled into their evening routine. Tommy had a bath, during which he played with his rubber dinosaurs, making them battle in the soapy water. Janet helped him into his favorite pajamas, the ones with the rocket ships, while Miguel checked the locks on all the doors, a habit he'd developed since moving to their new house 6 months earlier. At 8:30 p.m., Tommy brushed his teeth and climbed into bed. His room was exactly what you'd expect from a 7-year-old. Posters of dinosaurs and baseball players covered the walls, toy cars lined his windowsill, and a pile of books sat beside his bed. In the center of his nightstand sat his most prized possession, a small, yellow recording toy called a talkback bear. It was a simple device that could record short messages and play them back. "Tell me a story about dinosaurs, Mommy," Tommy had requested that night. Janet sat on the edge of his bed and spun a tale about a friendly triceratops who helped other dinosaurs find their way home when they got lost. Tommy's eyes grew heavy as she spoke, and by the time she kissed his forehead and whispered, "Sweet dreams, my love," he was already drifting off to sleep. Miguel peeked in around 9 p.m. to check on Tommy one more time. His son was sleeping peacefully, one arm wrapped around his stuffed dinosaur, the talkback bear sitting silently on the nightstand. Miguel pulled the blanket up to Tommy's chin, glanced at the window to make sure it was properly latched, and quietly closed the bedroom door. But sometime during that night, something went terribly wrong. Janet woke at 7 a.m. to the smell of coffee brewing. Miguel always started the morning routine early. She padded down the hallway to wake Tommy for school, expecting to find him still tangled in his blankets, probably clutching his stuffed dinosaur. Instead, she found an empty bed. The covers were thrown back as if Tommy had gotten up in a hurry. His pillow was askew. And the window that Miguel had checked the night before, was wide open, the curtains fluttering in the March morning breeze. "Tommy," Janet called out, her voice still thick with sleep. "Tommy, where are you, sweetie?" She checked the bathroom. Empty. She ran downstairs, thinking maybe he'd gotten up early for cereal. The kitchen was empty too. The living room, the basement, even the closets, she searched everywhere, calling his name with increasing panic. "Miguel!" she screamed. "Miguel!" Her husband came running from the kitchen, coffee mug still in hand. One look at Janet's face told him everything he needed to know. They searched the house together, then the yard, then the neighborhood. They called Tommy's name until their voices were hoarse. They knocked on neighbors' doors, checked every hiding spot a 7-year-old might choose. But Tommy Martinez had simply vanished. At 8:47 a.m., Miguel called 911. "My son is missing," he said, his voice breaking. "He was in his bed last night, and this morning he's just gone." And yet, despite the open window, despite the frantic searches, despite the dozens of police officers who would soon descend on Maple Street, there wasn't a single trace of where Tommy Martinez had gone. No footprints in the soft dirt beneath his window. No witnesses who had seen anything unusual. No signs of forced entry or struggle. It was as if a 7-year-old boy had simply evaporated into thin air. Within an hour of Miguel's call, Maple Street looked like a crime scene from a television drama. Police cars lined the quiet suburban street, their red and blue lights painting the neighboring houses in alternating colors. Detective Sarah Chin, a 20-year veteran of the Millbrook Police Department, stood in Tommy's bedroom, her trained eyes taking in every detail. The room told a story, but it wasn't a clear one. The bed was unmade, but not in a way that suggested struggle. More like a child had simply gotten up and left. The window was indeed open, pushed up about 18 inches, enough for a small person to climb through. But the screen was still in place, undamaged, which meant someone had to have unlatched it from the inside. Could he have opened this himself? Detective Chin asked Janet, who stood in the doorway, unable to enter her son's room. "Maybe," Janet whispered. "He's tall for his age. And curious. But why would he climb out the window? He knows he's not supposed to leave the house at night." Detective Chin examined the windowsill carefully. No scratches on the paint, no fibers caught on the frame. She looked down at the flower bed beneath Tommy's window. The soil was soft from recent rain, perfect for preserving footprints. But there were none, not child-sized, not adult-sized. Nothing. The investigation expanded quickly. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on every door within a 6-block radius. The questions were always the same. Did you see or hear anything unusual last night? Do you know the Martinez family? Have you noticed any strangers in the area recently? Most neighbors were genuinely shocked and eager to help. The Hendersons next door had been home all evening watching television. They hadn't heard anything unusual. The Kowalskis across the street had gone to bed early. No, they hadn't seen anyone walking around outside. But then there was Robert Finch. Mr. Finch lived 2 houses down from the Martinez family, in a duplex he'd been renting for about 8 months. He was a quiet man in his 40s, worked nights at a local factory, and mostly kept to himself. When Detective Chin knocked on his door at 11 a.m., Finch answered in his bathrobe, clearly having just woken up. "I work nights," he explained, his voice gravelly from sleep. "I usually don't get home until around 2 a.m., then sleep until noon." "So you were out last night?" Detective Chin asked. "Yeah, at the factory. Same as always." "Did you see anything unusual when you came home? Any cars that didn't belong? People walking around?" Finch shrugged. "Not really. It was pretty quiet. I think I saw a van parked down the street, but I didn't think much of it." Detective Chen's pen paused over her notepad. "A van? What kind of van?" "Dark-colored. Maybe blue or black. Hard to tell under the streetlights." "Did you see who it belonged to?" "I mind my own business." This was the first potential lead, and Detective Chin pursued it aggressively. She had officers check with every neighbor about the mysterious van. She requested the factory confirm Finch's work schedule. She even had the crime scene technicians dust for fingerprints around the Martinez house, though they found nothing unusual. But as the hours turned to days, more concerning details began to emerge about Tommy's disappearance and about the people in his life. There was Maria Santos, the Martinez family's babysitter, who had watched Tommy just 3 days before his disappearance. She was a teenage girl from the neighborhood, sweet and reliable, but during questioning, she mentioned something odd. Tommy was asking weird questions that night, Maria told Detective Chin. He wanted to know if bad men could climb through windows, and if his mom and dad would be able to find him if he got lost. It was kind of, I don't know, sad? Like he was worried about something. Then there was Dr. James Whitmore, Tommy's pediatrician, who revealed that Tommy had been having nightmares for several weeks before his disappearance. Janet had brought him in for a checkup, concerned about her son's sleep troubles. The boy was anxious, Dr. Whitmore recalled. He kept talking about the man who watches. I assumed it was typical childhood fears, maybe something he'd seen on television. But his mother was quite concerned. The man who watches. The phrase sent chills down Detective Chen's spine. She pressed Dr. Whitmore for more details, but he could only remember that Tommy had seemed genuinely frightened during his appointment. As the investigation deepened, Detective Chen couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching the Martinez family. Someone who knew their routines, knew that Tommy's room faced the backyard, knew exactly when the family would be asleep. The theory of a random kidnapping began to seem less likely. This felt planned, targeted. But by whom? The answer to that question seemed to slip further away with each passing day, as if the truth about Tommy Martinez was as elusive as the boy himself. Time has a cruel way of moving forward, even when your world has stopped completely. For Janet and Miguel Martinez, the days after Tommy's disappearance blurred together in a haze of police interviews, sleepless nights, and desperate hope that somehow, someway, their son would walk through the front door. The first month was the hardest. Every phone call could be the one, police with news, or maybe even Tommy himself, calling to say he was scared and wanted to come home. Janet couldn't bring herself to change the sheets on his bed or put away his toys. She left his dinosaur books stacked on his nightstand, exactly as he'd left them, and every evening she still set 4 places at the dinner table out of habit. Miguel threw himself into the search with an intensity that worried everyone around him. He printed thousands of missing child flyers and posted them on every telephone pole, store window, and community bulletin board within a 50-mile radius. Tommy's smiling face, taken at his school picture day just 2 months before his disappearance, looked out from grocery stores and gas stations across 3 counties. "Have you seen this boy?" became Miguel's constant refrain. He would approach strangers in parking lots, hand them flyers, and beg them to really look at the photo. His eyes held the desperate hope that somewhere, someone had seen his son. The media attention was both a blessing and a curse. Local television stations covered the story extensively in the first few weeks. Tommy's disappearance made the front page of the Millbrook Gazette for 3 consecutive days. A regional news program featured the case on their weekly crime segment. But with media attention came the cranks and attention seekers. The Martinez family received dozens of calls from people claiming to have seen Tommy. He was spotted at a mall in Pennsylvania, at a gas station in Ohio, boarding a bus in Virginia. Each lead required investigation, and each investigation led nowhere. The false sightings were almost worse than no leads at all. They offered hope that was repeatedly crushed. 3 months after Tommy's disappearance, Janet returned to her job at the local library. She needed something to occupy her mind, some semblance of normal routine. But normal felt impossible. Children would come in with their parents, and Janet would see Tommy's face in every boy with brown hair. She would hear his voice in every child who asked why, about the books they were checking out. Miguel's hardware store became his refuge, but even there, customers would approach him with sympathy or, worse, with their own theories about what had happened to Tommy. Some people whispered that the parents must have been involved. After all, most missing children were harmed by someone they knew. Others suggested that Tommy had simply run away, as if a 7-year-old could successfully disappear into the world on his own. By the 6-month mark, the investigation had stalled completely. Detective Chen had followed every lead, interviewed every person even tangentially connected to the Martinez family, and examined every piece of evidence multiple times. The mysterious van that Robert Finch had mentioned was never located. None of the potential suspects, and there were several, had any concrete connection to Tommy's disappearance. The case remained open, but realistically, it had gone cold. Janet and Miguel's marriage began to show the strain. Grief affects people differently, and while Janet retreated into quiet sadness, Miguel's desperate energy began to feel overwhelming. They went to counseling, but sitting in a therapist's office talking about their feelings couldn't bring back their son. They tried support groups for parents of missing children, but hearing other people's stories of loss only amplified their own pain. "We need to move forward," the counselor would say. "That doesn't mean giving up hope, but you need to find a way to live again." But how do you move forward when your child's bedroom sits empty down the hall? How do you live again when every morning you wake up hoping yesterday was just a nightmare? 1 year after Tommy's disappearance, the Martinez family held a memorial service, not a funeral, because there was no body, no confirmation that Tommy was gone forever. They planted a tree in the town park, with a small plaque that read, "For Tommy Martinez, who brought joy to everyone he met. We will never stop looking for you." The second anniversary passed more quietly. By then, the media had moved on to other stories. The flyers had faded and been replaced by advertisements for garage sales and lost pets. New families had moved into the neighborhood, people who didn't know about the little boy who had vanished from his bedroom window. But Janet never stopped hoping. She kept Tommy's room exactly as he had left it. His talkback bear sat on the nightstand, silent and waiting. His baseball cards remained scattered on his desk from the last time he'd been organizing them. His favorite book, Danny and the Dinosaur, lay open to the page where Janet had been reading to him that last night. Sometimes, late at night, Janet would sit in Tommy's room and talk to him as if he were still there. She would tell him about her day, about the new children's books that had come into the library, about how much she missed his endless questions. She would promise him that she and Daddy were still looking, still hoping, still believing that somehow he would come home. Miguel, meanwhile, had never stopped investigating on his own. He maintained contact with other parents of missing children, sharing information and theories. He subscribed to law enforcement publications, hoping to learn about new investigative techniques that might help solve Tommy's case. He even hired a private investigator with money from his retirement fund, though the PI's 6-month investigation yielded nothing new. As the years passed, some people suggested that the Martinez family should move, leave Millbrook, and start fresh somewhere new. But Janet couldn't bear the thought of leaving the house where Tommy might return. What if he came looking for them and they weren't there? "He knows this address," she would say. October 12, 2001. 10 years had transformed the Martinez house on Maple Street. The tire swing in the backyard had been taken down years ago, its absence a constant reminder of the child who would never use it again. Janet had turned 43 that summer, and the decade of grief had etched lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when Tommy was 7. Miguel, now 45, had gone completely gray and walked with the slightly stooped posture of a man carrying an invisible weight. Tommy's room had remained untouched, exactly as he had left it that March night in 1991. But the rest of the house had slowly been filled with the accumulated debris of a life interrupted, boxes of newspaper clippings about the case, files from the private investigator, stacks of letters from psychics and well-meaning strangers who claimed to know what had happened to their son. On that Tuesday evening, Janet had decided it was finally time to organize the storage room in the basement. The space had become a repository for everything too painful to keep in sight but too important to throw away. Tommy's outgrown clothes, his bicycle with training wheels, boxes of toys that had been too emotionally charged for Janet to deal with in the immediate aftermath of his disappearance. She worked methodically, sorting through items that told the story of a childhood cut short. There was the Halloween costume Tommy had worn when he was 5, a dinosaur outfit that he'd refused to take off for a week after Halloween was over. There were his finger paintings from kindergarten, proudly labeled with his name in shaky 7-year-old handwriting. There was the mitt he'd gotten for his 7th birthday, still stiff and unused because baseball season hadn't started yet when he disappeared. And then, buried beneath a stack of children's books, Janet found the talkback bear. The bright yellow toy looked exactly as it had 10 years ago, a simple recording device designed to look like a friendly cartoon bear. It had been Tommy's favorite gadget, and he'd used it constantly to record silly songs, made-up stories, and random observations about his day. Janet remembered how he would giggle as he played back his own voice, delighted by the magic of hearing himself speak. For several minutes, Janet just held the toy, remembering. She could almost see Tommy's face lighting up as he pressed the record button, almost hear his voice saying, "Listen to this, Mommy." But those were just memories. The toy itself had been silent for a decade. Almost without thinking, Janet pressed the play button. At first, there was the expected sound, Tommy's 7-year-old voice, bright and cheerful, recorded sometime in the weeks before his disappearance. "Hi, this is Tommy. I learned about dinosaurs today. Did you know that?" The recording cut off, as Tommy's messages often did when he got distracted. Janet smiled through her tears. Even after all these years, hearing his voice was both wonderful and heartbreaking. But then something else started playing. Something Janet had never heard before. The quality was different, muffled, distant, as if the toy had been recording from inside a drawer or under a blanket. At first, she could barely make out what she was hearing. There was rustling like fabric moving and then voices. The first voice was Tommy's, but not the bright, confident Tommy from the earlier recording. This Tommy sounded scared. "I don't want to go," the voice said, small and frightened. "I want my mommy." Janet's heart stopped. She turned up the volume and pressed her ear closer to the tiny speaker. A man's voice responded, too quiet and distorted for Janet to make out the words clearly. But the tone was unmistakable, stern, commanding, threatening. Tommy's voice again, "Please, I just want to go home." More muffled conversation, and then a sound that made Janet's blood run cold. Tommy crying, not the dramatic tears of a child having a tantrum, but the hopeless sobbing of a little boy who was truly afraid. The recording continued for another minute, filled with sounds Janet couldn't identify, car doors slamming, an engine starting, Tommy's voice growing more distant as if he were being moved away from wherever the toy had been hidden. And then, just before the recording ended, one more exchange. Tommy's voice, barely audible, "My mom's gonna find me. She always finds me when I'm lost." The man's voice, closer to the recording device now, and therefore slightly clearer, "Not this time, kid." The recording ended. Janet stared at the toy in her shaking hands, her mind reeling. The recording device could store up to 5 minutes of audio. Tommy had obviously pressed record at. Detective Marcus Webb had been on the Millbrook Police Department for 8 years when he inherited the Tommy Martinez case from Detective Chin. Unlike his predecessor, Webb had never met the Martinez family during the initial investigation. To him, Tommy was a file folder filled with reports, witness statements, and dead-end leads, one of a dozen cold cases that occupied the bottom drawer of his desk. But when Janet Martinez called the station on that October evening in 2001, everything changed. "You need to hear this," Janet told him over the phone, her voice urgent with a mixture of excitement and terror. "I found something. Something that was there all along." Webb arrived at the Martinez house within 30 minutes, accompanied by Detective Lisa Parker and a technician from the crime lab. The toy seemed almost laughably small and innocent, sitting on the kitchen table, just a child's recording device, worn from years of use. But when Janet pressed play, the mood in the room shifted immediately. Webb had heard recordings of crimes before, but this was different. This was a child's voice, scared and pleading, being preserved accidentally by his own toy. It was evidence from beyond the grave, because by 2001, everyone involved in the investigation assumed that Tommy Martinez was dead. "When did you last see this toy?" Webb asked. "The night before Tommy disappeared," Janet replied. "It was on his nightstand like always. The next morning, when we found his room empty, it was gone. We thought whoever took him might have taken it too." "But you found it in your basement?" "In a storage box. I thought it had been there since we packed up some of his toys after we realized he wasn't coming back quickly." Webb studied the toy carefully. "So this was recording during his abduction?" Miguel nodded grimly. "It must have been in his pajama pocket, or maybe he grabbed it when he woke up. He took that thing everywhere." The crime lab technician examined the device and confirmed what Webb suspected. The Talkback Bear was a simple analog recorder with no timestamp capability. There was no way to determine exactly when the recording had been made, though the family was certain it had to be from the night of the disappearance. More importantly, the technician was able to enhance the audio quality using modern digital equipment that hadn't been available in 1991. When the cleaned-up version played through better speakers, the details that had been muddy on the original toy became much clearer. The man's voice, while still muffled, now had distinct characteristics. The accent that Janet had noticed was indeed present, a slight southern drawl, the kind you might hear from someone who had lived in several different regions. There was also something else. The man seemed to know Tommy by name. In one section of the recording, clearly audible in the enhanced version, the man said, "Come on, Tommy boy, time to go." Tommy boy. It wasn't the sort of thing a stranger would say to a child he just kidnapped. It suggested familiarity, maybe even affection twisted into something dark. Webb immediately reopened the case file and began re-examining every person who had been questioned in 1991. He was looking for someone with a southern accent, someone who knew Tommy well enough to use a pet name, someone who had access to information about the family's routines. 3 names rose to the top of his list. Robert Finch, the neighbor who had reported seeing a van the night of the disappearance, was originally from Georgia. He'd moved to Millbrook about 8 months before Tommy vanished, and he'd moved away again just 6 weeks after the initial investigation concluded. Webb's efforts to locate Finch through motor vehicle records and employment history had been unsuccessful. The man seemed to have vanished as completely as Tommy himself. Then there was Carl Henderson, Tommy's Little League coach from the previous summer. Henderson had a slight accent, not Southern, exactly, but he'd mentioned during his original interview that he'd lived in Kentucky for several years. More concerning, he'd quit coaching abruptly in February 1991, just a month before Tommy's disappearance, citing personal reasons. The third name was the most troubling, James Whitmore, Tommy's pediatrician. Dr. Whitmore was originally from Alabama, and he'd been the one to tell Detective Chen about Tommy's nightmares, about the boy's fear of the man who watches. Looking back at the case file, Webb realized that Dr. Whitmore had exhibited an unusual amount of interest in the investigation, calling Detective Chen multiple times to ask about progress on the case. Webb decided to start with the person he could locate most easily, Dr. Whitmore. James Whitmore was now 58 years old, still practicing pediatric medicine, though he'd moved his practice to a larger clinic in the next county. When Webb called to request an interview, Dr. Whitmore seemed eager to help. "I've always wondered what happened to that poor boy," he told Webb over the phone. "Such a tragedy. Of course I'll meet with you. Anything I can do to help." They arranged to meet at the clinic the following afternoon. But when Webb arrived, Dr. Whitmore's behavior struck him as odd. The physician seemed nervous, asking multiple questions about what had prompted the police to reopen the case. When Webb mentioned the recording, Dr. Whitmore's face went pale. A recording? What kind of recording? Webb played a brief excerpt, not the most damning parts, just enough to gauge Whitmore's reaction. The doctor listened with what appeared to be genuine shock and sadness. "My God," he whispered. The trial of Robert Eugene Finch began in the spring of 2002, almost exactly 11 years after Tommy Martinez had vanished from his bedroom. The courtroom in Millbrook was packed with family members of missing children from across the Southeast, all hoping that Finch's conviction would bring some measure of closure to their own nightmares. Janet and Miguel Martinez sat in the front row every day of the trial, holding hands and listening to testimony that was both heartbreaking and cathartic. For over a decade, they had wondered if they had failed to protect their son somehow. The trial made it clear that Tommy's disappearance was not their fault. It was the calculated act of a predator who had targeted their family specifically. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. In addition to Finch's confession and the recording from Tommy's toy, investigators had found evidence linking him to 6 other child abductions across 4 states. DNA evidence from the North Carolina cabin matched genetic material found at 2 other crime scenes. Most damning of all, Finch had kept souvenirs from his victims, small personal items that he had preserved like trophies. Among these souvenirs was Tommy's stuffed dinosaur, the one he had been sleeping with the night he disappeared. When Janet saw it presented as evidence, she broke down completely. Miguel had to help her from the courtroom. Dr. James Whitmore also testified, admitting his failure to report Tommy's fears about his neighbor. His testimony was devastating not just because it revealed how Tommy's death might have been prevented, but because it highlighted how predators rely on adult disbelief and inaction to continue their crimes. "If I had taken that little boy seriously," Whitmore said from the witness stand, tears streaming down his face, "he might be 21 years old today instead of lying in a grave." Finch showed no emotion during the trial. He sat silently as prosecutors played the recording from Tommy's toy over and over again, showing no remorse as the courtroom listened to a 7-year-old boy pleading to go home to his parents. When the defense attorney asked Finch if he had anything to say to the Martinez family, he simply replied, "No." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and multiple counts related to his other victims. The judge sentenced Finch to death, though he would die of natural causes on death row 8 years later, never showing remorse for his crimes. For Janet and Miguel Martinez, the trial's conclusion brought a complex mixture of relief and renewed grief. They finally knew what had happened to their son, but the knowledge was almost harder to bear than the uncertainty had been. "At least now we know he's not out there somewhere, afraid and alone," Janet said in a statement to the media after Finch's conviction. "We know that his suffering is over, and we know where to find him." Tommy's remains were returned to Millbrook for burial. The funeral that had been impossible to hold in 1991 finally took place in May 2002. The entire town seemed to attend, not just people who had known Tommy, but strangers who had followed the case and been moved by the story of a little boy whose own toy had helped solve his murder. The Martinez family established the Tommy Martinez Foundation, dedicated to educating parents about the warning signs of predatory behavior and advocating for better training for pediatricians and other professionals who work with children. The foundation's motto, printed on all their materials, came from something Tommy had said in his final recording: "My mom's gonna find me." He was right. Janet would tell audiences at the foundation's speaking events. "It took 11 years, but we did find him. And in finding him, we found the man who took him." The case also led to significant changes in how missing children cases are handled. The Tommy Martinez Protocol now requires that all personal belongings from a missing child's room be thoroughly examined for potential evidence, including any electronic devices that might contain recordings or data. Dr. Whitmore lost his medical license and left the medical profession entirely. He became an advocate for mandatory reporting training, speaking to medical professionals about the importance of taking children's fears seriously, even when they seem irrational. Children don't usually lie about being afraid, he would tell audiences. When a child tells you someone is scaring them, believe them. I didn't, and a little boy died because of my failure. The small yellow talkback bear that had recorded Tommy's final hours was eventually returned to the Martinez family after serving its role in the legal proceedings. Janet keeps it on her mantle now, no longer as a reminder of loss, but as a symbol of her son's intelligence and courage. Even at 7 years old, even when he was scared and taken from everything familiar, Tommy found a way to leave us a message, she reflects. He found a way to tell us what happened to him. In his own way, he solved his own case. The house on Maple Street where Tommy had lived still stands, though the Martinez family sold it several years after the trial. They needed a fresh start, somewhere without the constant reminder of that empty bedroom window. But they never left Millbrook entirely. They moved just across town, close enough to visit Tommy's grave regularly. Peace isn't the right word. What we found is purpose. Tommy's death has meaning now because it has prevented other children from suffering the same fate. Every parent who learns to trust their child's fears, every doctor who takes a child's concerns seriously, every neighbor who pays attention to suspicious behavior, they're all part of Tommy's legacy. We'll never stop missing him. But we know that his voice, literally his voice, recorded on that little toy, has saved other children. That's not peace, exactly, but it's something. It's enough to keep going. The story of Tommy Martinez serves as a reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, that predators often present themselves as helpful neighbors and concerned community members. But it also demonstrates the power of a parent's love, the importance of believing children when they express fear, and the remarkable ways that truth has of eventually surfacing even after years of silence. Sometimes justice comes too late to save the victim. But it's never too late to honor their memory by ensuring that their story protects others. Tommy Martinez was 7 years old when he disappeared from his bedroom in 1991. He would have turned 40 in 2024. Instead, he remains forever 7 in the memories of those who loved him and in the foundation that carries on his name. But in the most important way, Tommy did make it home. His voice, preserved accidentally on a child's toy, led his parents to the truth about his fate and brought his killer